Welcome to Saga Dream Tales, the place where you can relax, unwind, and drift into calm stories shaped by ancient worlds. Here, every tale moves slowly, carried by soft words and peaceful rhythm, made to ease your mind and guide you into a quiet space. In today's journey, we follow Thor as he travels to the distant land of the giants, where ice meets fire and old wisdom waits in the frozen mountain. His path is gentle, steady, and filled with the quiet breath of the old northern land. All you need to do now is sit back, breathe deeply, and let the story unfold at its own slow pace. Close your eyes if you wish, let your body settle into comfort, and allow yourself to be carried away to a time when gods walked the earth and mountains held ancient secrets. The journey begins now. In the ancient days, when the world was young and mountains still remembered their birth, there lived a mighty god named Thor. He dwelt in the golden halls of Asgard, the realm of the gods, where the buildings gleamed in the eternal light and the air tasted of honey and morning dew. Thor was the god of thunder, the protector of both gods and humans, and he carried with him a hammer called Mjolnir that never missed its mark and always returned to his hand. Thor had hair the color of autumn wheat and a beard that flowed like rivers of copper. His eyes held the blue of summer skies, though when anger stirred within him, they darkened to the gray of storm clouds. He wore simple clothes despite his divine nature, preferring practical leather and wool to the fine silks that other gods favored. Around his waist, he wore a magical belt that doubled his already great strength, and on his hands, he wore iron gloves that allowed him to grip his hammer without harm. The giants lived far from Asgard, in a land called Jotunheim. This was a place of endless winters and towering peaks, where ice-formed castles that touched the clouds and snow fell in silence for months without end. The giants were beings of immense size and age, older even than the gods themselves. Some said the world had been made from the body of the first giant, and that the mountains were his bones and the seas were his blood. The giants remembered this, and they watched the gods with ancient eyes that held both wisdom and resentment. Between the gods and the giants, there had always been an uneasy peace. Sometimes they fought, when the giants grew too bold or when the gods felt threatened. Other times they traded, sharing knowledge and goods across the vast distances that separated their realms. And sometimes, though rarely, there was friendship. For not all giants were fierce, and not all gods were proud. One morning in Asgard, Thor woke to find the sun casting long shadows across his chamber floor. He had dreamed of Jotunheim, of walking through snow that came up to his knees, and seeing mountains that blocked out half the sky. In his dream, an old giant had beckoned to him, gesturing towards something Thor could not quite see. When he tried to move closer, the dream faded, leaving only the feeling that he was needed somewhere far away. Thor rose from his bed and dressed slowly, thinking about the dream. He was not one to ignore such visions, for the dreams of gods often carried meaning. He fastened his belt, pulled on his gloves, and lifted Mjolnir from where it rested beside his bed. The hammer felt warm in his hands, as it always did, like holding a piece of summer lightning. He walked through the halls of his home, past tapestries that showed the deeds of heroes and the births of stars. He walked through gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and fountains sang with water that never grew still. He walked until he came to the great bridge called Bifrost, which connected Asgard to the other realms of the world. Heimdall stood guard at the bridge, as he always did. Heimdall could hear grass growing in distant meadows and see for 100 miles in any direction. He needed less sleep than a bird, and was more loyal than the roots of mountain. When he saw Thor approaching, he nodded in greeting, his golden armor catching the light like a second sun. Thor explained his dream to Heimdall, describing the old giant and the feeling of being called to Jotunheim. Heimdall listened without interrupting, his keen eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the rainbow bridge. When Thor finished speaking, Heimdall was quiet for a moment, considering what he had heard. Then Heimdall told Thor that he too had sensed something stirring in Jotunheim. Over the past weeks, he had heard unusual sounds coming from that frozen realm, like the creaking of ice shelves and the groaning of ancient stone. He had seen lights moving in the northern distances, though whether they were fires or magic, he could not say. Something was happening in the land of giants, and perhaps Thor's dream was connected to it. Thor decided he would journey to Jotunheim to investigate. He would go quietly, without an army of gods at his back, for he did not wish to start a war over what might be nothing. He would travel as the mortals traveled, by foot and by will, and he would see what could be seen. Heimdall opened the way for him, and Thor stepped onto the Bifrost. The bridge felt solid beneath his feet, though it was made of light and air and ancient magic. Colors swirled around him as he walked, red and blue and green and gold, each shade singing with a different note. The bridge stretched down from Asgard like a road made of rainbows, connecting the realm of gods to the world below. Thor descended for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely on the Bifrost. When at last he reached the bottom, he found himself standing in a forest of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of ice and earth. Above him, the sky was the pale gray of winter afternoons, and ahead of him, mountains rose like the walls of some impossibly vast fortress. He began to walk north, toward those mountains, toward Jotunheim. The snow crunched beneath his boots with each step, and his breath formed white clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Around him, the forest was quiet, the kind of deep silence that comes when snow muffles every sound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Thor walked for hours through that forest, following paths that only he could see. Sometimes he passed frozen streams where the ice was so clear he could see fish suspended beneath it, waiting for spring. Sometimes he passed clearings where deer had scraped away snow to reach the grass below, their tracks forming patterns like ancient writing. And sometimes he passed trees that had fallen under the weight of snow and time, their roots exposed like the fingers of sleeping giants. As the day wore on, the forest began to thin, and the land started to rise. Thor climbed hills that grew steeper with each passing mile, his powerful legs carrying him upward without tiring. The trees became smaller and more sparse, bent by winds that never stopped blowing. The snow grew deeper, sometimes reaching his thighs, but he pushed through it as easily as a man might wade through water. By the time the sun began to set, Thor had left the forest far behind. He stood now on a vast plain of snow and ice that stretched toward the mountains like a frozen sea. The wind here was stronger, biting through his clothes and pulling at his hair and beard. The sky had darkened to the deep blue of evening, and the first stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant and watching. Thor made camp for the night beneath a large boulder that offered some shelter from the wind. He did not need fire to stay warm, for the blood of gods runs hotter than mortal blood. But he gathered some dry wood that he found wedged in the rock and made a small fire anyway. There was comfort in the flames, in their dancing light and the crackling sounds they made. The fire reminded him of the hearths in Asgard, where gods gathered to share stories and drink mead and laugh at the antics of the world. He sat beside his fire and ate some of the dried meat and bread he had brought with him. The food was simple but good, and he chewed slowly, thinking about what might await him in the mountain. The giants were unpredictable, each one different from the last. Some were wise and kind, willing to share their knowledge with those who approached them with respect. Others were cruel and hungry, seeing all smaller beings as either threats or food. Thor had met both kinds, and he knew better than to assume he knew which type he would encounter. When he had finished eating, Thor lay down on his cloak and looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter here than in Asgard, perhaps because the air was so clear and cold. He picked out the familiar patterns, the great bear, and the hunter, and the serpent that coiled around the northern sky. These were the same stars that mortals saw from their villages and farms, the same lights that had guided travelers since the beginning of time. Sleep came slowly to Thor that night. He could hear the wind howling across the plain, could feel the cold seeping up from the frozen ground beneath him. But eventually, his eyes grew heavy, and he drifted into dreams where he walked through halls made of ice and spoke with beings whose faces he could never quite see. When he woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange. Thor rose and stretched, his muscles warm and ready despite the cold night. He scattered the remains of his fire and shouldered his pack, then turned once more toward the mountains. The second day of walking was harder than the first. The land continued to rise, and the snow grew deeper still. Sometimes Thor had to use his hammer to clear a path through drifts that were taller than he was. The wind picked up as well, blowing snow into his face and making it hard to see more than a few dozen yards ahead. But he pressed on, guided by some instinct that told him he was going the right way. By midday, Thor reached the foothills of the mountains. Here, the snow gave way in places to exposed stone, black and gray rock that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The wind carved the snow into strange shapes, forming dunes and ridges that looked like frozen waves. In some places, the ice was so hard and smooth that it reflected the sky like a mirror, creating the illusion that Thor was walking through clouds. He began to climb into the mountains proper, following a narrow pass between two towering peaks. The walls of stone on either side rose hundreds of feet above him, blocking out much of the sky. His footsteps echoed strangely in this confined space, bouncing off the rocks and returning to him as whispers. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in those echoes, though he knew it was only tricks of sound and stone. The pass wound upward for miles, twisting and turning like a river carved through rock. Sometimes it was so narrow that Thor had to turn sideways to squeeze through, his shoulders brushing both walls at once. Other times it opened into small valleys, where snow had accumulated in deep pools, forcing him to wade through or find ways to climb around. As afternoon faded toward evening, Thor emerged from the pass onto a high plateau. Before him stretched a landscape unlike anything in the lower world. Mountains surrounded him on all sides, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed close enough to touch. Between the mountains lay valleys filled with ice, great glaciers that moved so slowly their motion could only be measured over centuries. The ice was every shade of blue, from the pale color of morning sky to the deep blue that was almost black. In the distance, Thor could see something that made him pause. There, built into the side of the tallest mountain, was a structure. It was enormous, with walls that looked like they had been carved from the mountain itself. Towers rose from those walls, tall and angular, their tops hidden in the low-hanging clouds. Even from miles away, Thor could tell that this was the work of giants, for no human hands could have shaped stones so large, and no god would have built something so austere and cold. This, then, was what he had been seeking. This fortress, or castle, or hall, was what his dream had been leading him toward. Thor felt a strange mixture of anticipation and caution as he looked at it. He had visited giant halls before, but each time was different, and each time carried its own dangers. He made his way across the plateau toward the structure, walking between fields of ice and round crevasses that dropped into darkness. The journey took longer than it appeared, for distances were deceiving in this land of giants where everything was built on a scale larger than the world of men. What looked like an hour's walk turned into 3 hours, and still the structure seemed to recede before him. But eventually, as the sun touched the western horizon, Thor reached the base of the mountain and stood before the giant's hall. Up close, it was even more impressive than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were made of stones that each must have weighed as much as houses, fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. The door was a single slab of dark wood, bound with iron, and it stood as tall as 5 men stacked upon each other's shoulders. Thor approached the door slowly, his hand resting on Mjolnir's handle. He was not afraid, for gods do not feel fear the way mortals do, but he was respectful and alert. He reached up and knocked on the door with the bottom of his hammer. 3 solid strikes that boomed like thunder through the valley. The sound echoed away into silence, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Thor waited, patient as the stones around him. Then slowly, the great door began to move. It swung inward without a sound, despite its enormous size, revealing a darkness beyond. Thor stepped through the doorway into the hall. Inside, the scale was even more overwhelming. The ceiling was so high above him that it disappeared into shadow, supported by pillars that were like entire trees turned to stone. The floor was smooth and cold, made of a dark rock that reflected the dim light like water. Along the walls, torches burned with blue flame, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The hall was empty of furniture or decoration, just a vast open space that seemed to go on forever. Thor's footsteps echoed as he walked, each sound repeating a dozen times before fading away. The air smelled of stone and ice, and something else, something old and indefinable. He walked deeper into the hall, following the line of torches along the wall. As he went, he began to notice details he had missed at first. There were carvings on the pillars, scenes from ancient times showing the birth of the world and the wars between giants and God. The carvings were beautiful in their own harsh way, each line cut deep and precise into the stone. At the far end of the hall, Thor found a stairway. It spiraled upward into the darkness, the steps worn smooth by countless years of use. Without hesitation, Thor began to climb. Up and up he went, around and around, passing doorways that opened onto empty rooms and windows that looked out at the snow-covered valleys below. The climb seemed endless, but finally, Thor reached the top of the stairs and found himself in a different kind of space. This was not a hall, but a chamber, smaller and more intimate, though still large by human standard. In the center of the chamber burned a fire, and beside the fire sat an old giant. The giant was ancient beyond measure, his skin like weathered stone and his hair like frost on winter grass. He was wrapped in furs and blankets, and his eyes were closed, as if he slept or meditated. But as Thor entered the chamber, those eyes opened, and Thor saw that they were kind, filled with the sadness and wisdom that came from living through ages of the world. The old giant gestured toward a spot near the fire, inviting Thor to sit. Thor approached slowly and sat down cross-legged on the cold floor, laying Mjolnir across his knees. The fire crackled between them, warm and bright, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a long time, neither of them moved or made any sound. They simply sat together in the firelight, god and giant, old enemies and older neighbors. Outside, the wind howled around the tower, but inside, there was only warmth and silence and waiting. Finally, the old giant reached out and placed his hand on the floor between them. As he did so, images began to appear in the smooth stone, like reflections on water. Thor watched as the stone showed him scenes from the past, and the present, and perhaps the future. He saw the world as it had been in the beginning, when everything was ice and fire and the space between. He saw the first giant, enormous beyond comprehension, from whose body the gods had made the earth and sky. He saw the wars that followed, giants and gods, fighting for control of the newborn world, battles that shook mountains and dried seas. He saw the building of Asgard, the golden realm of the gods, and the retreat of the giants to Jotunheim, their icy homeland. He saw the walls that were built, the boundaries that were drawn, the uneasy peace that settled over everything like snow. Then the images shifted, showing Thor the present. He saw Jotunheim as it was now, a land slowly freezing, the ice advancing even in places that had been free of it before. He saw giants huddling in their halls, burning through the last of their fuel, watching their world turn colder and harder with each passing year. And then he saw something that made his heart grow heavy with understanding. Deep beneath the mountains of Jotunheim, something was dying. An ancient source of warmth, some eternal fire that had kept the land habitable even in its coldest places, was going out. It had burned since the beginning of the world, a remnant of the fire from creation. But now it flickered and faded like a candle reaching the end of its wick. Without that fire, Jotunheim would become truly uninhabitable, even for giants. The cold would grow so intense that nothing could survive it, not ice nor stone, nor immortal flesh. The giants would have to leave their homeland or perish in it. Thor looked up from the images and met the old giant's eyes. In that gaze, he saw the question that had not been spoken. The giant was asking for help, not for himself, but for his people, for all the giants who would freeze when the last fire went out. Thor felt the weight of that request settle on his shoulders. He thought about the long history between gods and giants, the violence and the hatred and the fear. He thought about all the reasons he could refuse, all the ways he could justify turning away from this problem that was not his own. But he also thought about the future, about a world without giants, without their ancient wisdom and their long memories. He thought about the balance of things, about how the world needed both fire and ice, both gods and giants, to remain whole. Slowly, Thor nodded. He would help, though he did not yet know how. He would find a way to rekindle the ancient fire, or to find a new source of warmth for Jotunheim. He would do this not because he loved the giants, For in truth, he did not. But because it was right, and because sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to help your enemy. The old giant smiled then, a small, sad smile that held gratitude and relief. He reached out once more and touched the stone, and this time, new images appeared. These showed Thor a path, a way down into the deepest parts of the mountain where the ancient fire still flickered. The path was dangerous, full of ice caves and narrow passages and places where the stone itself was unstable. But Thor had never been one to shy away from danger. He studied the images carefully, memorizing each turn and landmark. When he was confident he understood the way, he nodded to the giant and rose to his feet. The giant remained seated by the fire, but he raised one hand in farewell or blessing. Thor turned and made his way back down the spiraling stairs, back through the great empty hall, back out into the cold mountain air. Night had fallen while he was inside, and the stars blazed overhead with fierce brilliance. Thor stood for a moment outside the door, breathing the icy air and letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Then he began to walk around the base of the mountain, looking for the entrance to the deep places that the old giant had shown him. He found it on the north side of the mountain, a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for even a normal man to squeeze through. Thor had to remove his pack and turn sideways, but he managed to slip into the opening. Inside, the passage widened slightly, and he could see by the faint light that filtered in from outside. The passage led downward at a steep angle, the floor slippery with ice. Thor descended carefully, using his hammer for balance when the slope grew too steep. The walls pressed close on either side, rough stone that scraped against his shoulders and back. Sometimes he had to duck to avoid low-hanging rocks, and sometimes he had to climb down short drops where the passage descended in steps. Deeper and deeper he went, leaving the surface world far behind. The darkness grew absolute, so thick that even Thor's divine eyes could barely penetrate it. He paused and struck his hammer against the stone, and where the hammer hit, sparks flew up, enough to give him light to see by for a few moments. The passage eventually opened into a cave, a vast hollow space within the mountain. Thor could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, and the distant sound of something creaking and groaning. He struck his hammer again, and in the brief flash of light, he saw that the cave was filled with ice. Great formations of ice hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and ice covered the floor in sheets and ridges. Thor made his way across the cave, testing each step carefully, for the ice was treacherous and hid cracks and holes that could swallow the unwary. It took him a long time to cross the cave, moving slowly and deliberately through the darkness, stopping often to create sparks for light. On the far side of the cave, he found another passage leading further down. This one was narrower than the first, barely more than a crack in the rock. Thor had to remove his belt and gloves and leave them behind to fit through, taking only his hammer with him. He squeezed into the crack and began to descend, moving by feel now, for there was no room to swing his hammer for light. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes forcing him to crawl on his belly, sometimes letting him stand upright for a few steps before narrowing again. Thor lost track of time in that darkness, lost track of distance and direction. He simply kept moving downward, trusting the images the old giant had shown him, trusting his own instincts. And then, gradually, he became aware of a change. The air grew warmer, just slightly, just enough to notice, and there was light ahead, a faint red glow that barely touched the darkness, but was enough to give him hope. Thor pushed forward with renewed energy, and finally, he emerged from the narrow passage into another cave. This one was different from the first. Here, the walls glowed with a reddish light, and heat radiated from cracks in the floor. In the center of the cave, surrounded by stone that had melted and reformed into strange shapes, was a pool of fire. But it was a fire unlike any Thor had ever seen. It did not burn wood or coal, but seemed to burn the very stone itself. Or perhaps it burned nothing at all, and was simply pure fire made manifest. The flames were low, barely rising above the edges of the pool, and they flickered weakly, as if a strong wind might blow them out at any moment. This, then, was the ancient fire, the last remnant of the flames from the beginning of the world. Thor approached it slowly, feeling the heat on his face and arms. Even in its diminished state, The fire was powerful, older than gods or giants, older than anything except the void from which all things came. Thor stood at the edge of the pool and looked into the flames. He could see shapes moving in the fire, images and memories from ages past. He saw the world being born, saw the first light breaking through the darkness, saw the joy and terror of creation. He knew what he had to do, though the knowledge came to him without words, like instinct or memory. The fire was dying because it had been burning for so long, because even eternal things wear down eventually under the weight of time. But it could be renewed, given new fuel, given something to feed on that would let it burn bright again. And Thor knew what that fuel must be. He had brought it with him without knowing, had carried it down into the depths without realizing its purpose. His hammer, Mjolnir, was more than just a weapon. It was a piece of the storm made solid, a fragment of the lightning that connects earth and sky. It carried within it the power of thunder, the energy of tempests that never ceased. Thor lifted his hammer and held it over the pool of fire. The flames reached up toward it like hands, drawn to the power contained within the divine weapon. Thor hesitated for just a moment, for Mjolnir was precious to him, more than just a tool, but a companion and friend. But he thought of the giants freezing in their halls, thought of the old giant by his fire, thought of the balance of the world that required both warmth and cold to remain stable. He thought of all the battles he had fought with his hammer, all the enemies he had struck down, all the storms he had called forth, and then he let go. Mjolnir fell into the pool of fire, and the moment it touched the flames, everything changed. The fire roared up, suddenly blazing with fierce intensity. It consumed the hammer, not destroying it but absorbing it, taking its power and making it part of itself. The flames surged higher and higher, filling the cave with light and heat. Thor stumbled back from the intensity of it, shielding his eyes with his arm. The heat was almost unbearable, even for a god. The walls of the cave began to glow, not just with reflected light, but with their own internal warmth. The fire spread through the cracks in the floor, running through the stone like blood through veins, carrying heat and life to the frozen land above. For a long moment, Thor simply stood and watched the fire burn. Then he felt something in his hand, a familiar weight and warmth. He looked down and saw that Mjolnir had returned to him, as it always did, called back by the bond between god and weapon. But the hammer was different now. It glowed with an inner light, warm to the touch, and when he lifted it, he could feel that it was even more powerful than before. The fire had not consumed Mjolnir, but had transformed it, had added its ancient power to the hammer's might, and in exchange, the hammer had given the fire new strength, new fuel to burn for another age of the world. Thor turned and began the long journey back to the surface. He climbed up through the narrow passage, squeezed through the crack, crossed the cave of ice, and ascended the sloping passage. Every step felt lighter than before, as if the mountain itself was grateful for what he had done. When he finally emerged into the night air, he found that the world had changed. The wind was warmer now, just slightly, and the stars seemed to shine with less fierce cold. The mountain around him groaned and cracked as the ancient fire spread through its roots, warming stone that had not felt heat in centuries. Thor made his way back around the entrance of the giant's hall and knocked once more on the great door. It opened immediately, as if the old giant had been waiting just inside. Thor entered and found the giant still sitting by his fire, but now the ancient one was smiling, truly smiling, for he could feel the warmth returning to his homeland. Thor sat once more beside the fire, and the giant reached out and clasped his hand, a gesture of gratitude that needed no word. They sat together for a while, god and giant, sharing the warmth and the silence. Then Thor rose to leave, for his task was complete, and he wished to return to Asgard. The old giant walked with him to the door, moving slowly, but with more energy than before. At the threshold, the giant spoke for the first time, his voice like stones grinding together, deep and slow. He thanked Thor, not just for himself, but for all his people, for all the giants who would live because of what the god had done. He said that this deed would be remembered, that it would be carved in stone and told in stories around giant fires for as long as the world endured. He said that between gods and giants, there would always be differences and sometimes conflict, But now there would also be this memory of help given when it was needed most. Thor nodded, accepting the giant's word. He turned and walked away from the hall, back across the plateau, back through the mountain pass. As he walked, he could feel the land changing around him. The snow was beginning to melt in places, revealing patches of dark earth. The wind was no longer quite so bitter. Water dripped from icicles. And somewhere in the distance, he heard the crack of ice breaking as a frozen river began to flow again. The journey back took less time than the journey there, or perhaps it only felt that way because Thor's heart was lighter. He walked through the day and into the night, and by the time the sun rose again, he was descending from the mountains into the pine forest. The forest, too, seemed different. Birds were singing in the trees, their songs bright and clear in the morning air. Small animals moved through the underbrush, foraging for food now that the worst of the cold had passed. The snow was melting rapidly here, turning to slush and then to water that ran in streams between the trees. Thor walked through the forest with a feeling of satisfaction, not the satisfaction of battle won or enemy defeated, but something deeper and more lasting. He had done something that mattered, something that would have effects rippling out through time. He had chosen compassion over hatred, help over revenge, and the world was better for it. He reached the place where the Bifrost touched the earth, and he stepped onto the rainbow bridge. As he ascended toward Asgard, he looked back once at the mountains of Jotunheim. From this distance, they were blue and hazy, already fading into memory. But he knew he would not forget them, or the old giant by his fire, or the choice he had made in the depths of the earth. When Thor reached Asgard, Heimdall was waiting for him at the bridge's end. The Guardian looked at Thor with his keen eyes and smiled slightly, for he could see what had happened even without being told. He nodded in approval and stepped aside to let Thor pass. Thor walked through the Golden Realm toward his home, and as he went, other gods stopped to greet him. They noticed that his hammer glowed differently now, that there was a new warmth to it that had not been there before. Some asked him where he had been and what he had done, and Thor told them, simply and without embellishment. Some of the gods were surprised that he had helped the giants. Some were skeptical that it had been necessary, but others understood, especially the older gods who remembered the earliest days when gods and giants had not yet become enemies, when the world was new and all beings worked together to shape it. Thor returned to his hall and rested, for even gods need rest after great deeds. He slept deeply and without dreams, his hammer beside him, warm as a living thing. And when he woke, he felt renewed, ready for whatever challenges might come next. In the days that followed, word spread through all the realms of what Thor had done. The story traveled from god to god, from giant to giant, and even down to the world of humans, where poets and storytellers added it to their collection of tales about the gods. The giants of Jotunheim prospered in the new warmth. They did not grow soft or lose their strength, for they were still creatures of ice and winter. But now the cold was bearable. Now there was warmth enough to sustain life even in the deepest parts of their realm. They did not forget what Thor had done for them, and though there would still be conflicts between gods and giants in the years to come, there was also respect, a recognition that sometimes can come from unexpected places. Thor, for his part, did not dwell on what he had done. He was not one for excessive pride or self-congratulation. He had seen a problem, and he had solved it. That was simply who he was, what he did. He was Thor, god of thunder, protector of the 9 realms. And he would continue to be these things until the end of the world. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when he sat in his hall and looked at the fire burning in his hearth, he thought about the ancient fire deep in the mountains of Jotunheim. He thought about how it had been dying, and how now it burned bright again, fed by the power of his hammer and burning with a light that would last for ages to come. And sometimes, when storms rolled across the sky and lightning flashed from cloud to cloud, Thor felt his hammer pulse with warmth, as if it remembered the fire, as if it still carried a piece of those ancient flames within it. And he would smile, content in the knowledge that he had done something good, something that mattered beyond battles and victories. The seasons turned in their endless cycle. Spring came to all the realms, melting the last of winter's snow and bringing green shoots up from the earth. Summer followed, warm and golden, with long days and short nights. Then came autumn with its harvest and its preparation for the cold to come. And finally, winter returned. But it was a gentler winter now, especially in Jotunheim, where the ancient fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The world changed as it always did, with new heroes being born and old heroes dying, with kingdoms rising and falling, with the slow turning of the great wheel of time. But the fire in Jotunheim continued to burn, and the giants continued to tell the story of Thor and his hammer, of the god who had given his greatest weapon to save his ancient enemy. Thor continued his work as protector of the realms. He fought monsters and giants and all manner of threats to the order of the world. He traveled to distant lands and had countless adventures. He laughed and feasted with the other gods, and he walked among humans, helping them when they needed it most. But always, no matter where he went or what he did, he carried with him the memory of that journey to Jotunheim, of the old giant by his fire, of the choice he had made in the depths of the earth. It had changed him in ways that were hard to put into words. He was still Thor, still the thunder god, still fierce and strong and quick to anger. But he was also more than that. He had learned that strength was not just about fighting, that protecting meant more than defending against enemy. Sometimes protection meant helping those who could not help themselves, even when they were old foes, even when there was no glory in it. The hammer at his side was a constant reminder of this lesson. It had always returned to him, no matter how far he threw it or where he left it. But now it carried within it a piece of the ancient fire, a warmth that represented not destruction, but preservation, not conquest, but compassion. In Asgard, life continued in its golden splendor. The gods gathered in their great halls to feast and share stories. They drank mead from horns and cups of precious metals. They listened to songs sung by skilled poets who could make words dance like flames. They made plans for the future and remembered deeds from the past. Thor was often at the center of these gatherings, for the gods loved to hear his tales of adventure and battle. But now he also had a different kind of story to tell, a quieter story about a journey into darkness and a choice made in the depths of the earth. When he told this story, the other gods fell silent and listened carefully, for it spoke to something deeper than the usual tales of glory and victory. Odin, the All-Father, the king of the gods, heard Thor's story with particular interest. Odin was older and wiser than the other gods, having sacrificed much to gain knowledge and understanding. He had hung from the world tree for 9 days and nights to learn the secrets of the room. He had given one of his eyes for a drink from the well of wisdom. He knew that the greatest power came not from strength alone, but from wisdom and compassion. When Thor finished his story, Odin nodded slowly, his one remaining eye bright with approval. He understood what his son had learned, understood the significance of what had happened in Jotunheim. He saw that Thor was becoming not just a mighty warrior, but a true protector. Someone who understood that protecting meant more than just fighting enemies. The goddess Frigg, Thor's mother, also understood. She was wise in her own way, with a knowledge of fate and the future that even Odin sometimes envied. She looked at her son with pride and love, for she could see the man he was becoming, the god he was growing into. She knew that the realms would need someone like him in the difficult days that lay ahead. For even in those golden days, there were signs of trouble to come. The world was old, and like all old things, it carried within it the seeds of its own ending. The gods knew this, even if they did not speak of it often. They knew that one day there would be a final battle, a great ending that would reshape everything. But that day was still far off, still hidden behind layers of time and possibility. In the meantime, life went on. Thor continued his journeys and his adventures. He traveled to the land of the elves, where everything was beautiful and eternal, and slightly sad. He traveled to the realm of the dwarves, who lived beneath the mountains and crafted wonders from metal and stone. He traveled to the world of humans, walking among them in disguise, helping those who needed help and learning from their struggles and triumph. Everywhere he went, Thor carried his hammer and the warmth it now contained. And sometimes, when he found people suffering from cold or hunger or fear, he would rest his hammer on the ground and let its warmth spread out into the earth, bringing comfort and hope to those who needed it most. The humans did not understand what was happening when this occurred. They only knew that suddenly the cold seemed less bitter, that their fires burned brighter, that hope returned to hearts that had grown heavy with despair. They attributed it to their own gods, or to luck, or to the changing of the seasons. They did not know that Thor stood among them, using the gift he had received from the ancient fire to help them through their darkest times. Years turned into decades, and decades into centuries. The world aged, but slowly, for time moves differently in the realm of gods than in the realm of mortals. Thor aged too, not in body but in spirit, growing wiser and more thoughtful with each passing year. He returned to Jotunheim many times over the centuries, always traveling quietly and without fanfare. Sometimes he went to visit the old giant by his fire, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, sharing the warmth and the peace. Other times he went to explore the land, to see how it was changing and growing now that the ancient fire burned bright again. The changes in Jotunheim were remarkable. Where once there had been only ice and bare stone, now there were valleys with hardy grass and twisted trees. Where once there had been only silence, now there were sounds of water running and wind blowing through mountain passes. The land was still harsh and cold, still a place of winter and ice. But it was alive in a way it had not been for ages. The giants flourished in this renewed land. They built new halls and carved new passages through the mountains. They gathered in places where warmth rose from the earth and made gardens where tough plants grew despite the cold. They remembered the old ways but also learned new ones, adapting to the changed world while keeping their ancient traditions alive. And always, in their stories and their songs, they remembered Thor and what he had done. They carved his image in stone, showing him standing with his hammer over the ancient fire. They told their children about the god who had saved their homeland, teaching them that enemies could become helpers, that the boundaries between different peoples were not as fixed as they sometimes seemed. This knowledge spread beyond Jotunheim. The dwarves heard the stories and nodded in understanding, for they knew the value of helping others even when it cost something precious. The elves heard the stories and added them to their own vast collection of tales, weaving them into songs that would last forever. And the humans heard the stories and were inspired, learning that even the mighty could show compassion, that strength and kindness were not opposites but companions. In Asgard, the story became part of the education of young gods. When new divine beings came into their power, when they began to understand what it meant to be immortal and mighty, they were told about Thor's journey to Jotunheim. They learned that power was not just about what you could destroy, but about what you could preserve and protect. Thor himself became a teacher in his own way, though he never sought the role. Young gods would come to him with questions about duty and responsibility, about when to fight and when to help. He would answer their questions simply and honestly, drawing on his own experiences, especially that long journey into the frozen north, and the choice he had made in the darkness beneath the mountain. One young god in particular sought Thor's guidance frequently. This was Modi, one of Thor's own sons, who had inherited his father's strength, but was still learning how to use it wisely. Modi was eager and brave, but sometimes impulsive, quick to anger, and quick to action. Thor saw much of his younger self in his son, and worked patiently to teach him the lessons he had learned. He told Modi about the ancient fire, and about the old giant who had asked for help. He explained how difficult it had been to give up his hammer, even knowing it would return, even knowing it was the right thing to do. He spoke about the weight of responsibility that came with power, about how those who were strong had a duty to protect those who were weak, even when the weak were also enemies. Modi listened to these lessons with growing understanding. He began to see that being a god meant more than just being powerful. It meant making choices that served the greater good, even when those choices were hard. It meant looking beyond immediate conflicts to see the larger patterns and needs of the world. As Modi grew in wisdom, Thor felt a quiet satisfaction. He was passing on not just his strength, but his understanding, not just his power, but his compassion. He was helping to shape a new generation of gods who would be ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. The seasons continued their endless dance. Spring and summer and autumn and winter, over and over, each cycle bringing small changes that accumulated into larger transformation. The world tree that connected all the realms grew ever so slightly taller, its roots delving deeper into the earth, its branches reaching higher into the sky. Thor continued to walk beneath that tree, continued to travel the paths between the realms. He was older now in spirit, though his body remained as strong as ever. His red beard had streaks of silver in it, not from age but from the wisdom he had gained. His eyes held depths they had not held in his youth, layers of understanding that came from experience and reflection. He still fought when fighting was needed. He still defended the realms against threats from outside and within. But now, he also sought other solutions when they were possible, tried diplomacy before battle, looked for ways to resolve conflicts without violence. He had learned that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought within yourself, the struggles to choose the right path when the easy path was so tempting. One day, Thor returned to Jotunheim and found that the old giant had passed away. The ancient being had lived for countless ages, had seen the world born and shaped, had guided his people through trials and triumphs. But even giants do not live forever, and the time had come for him to return to the earth from which all beings ultimately came. Thor stood in the great hall where he had first met the old giant, looking at the place by the fire where the Ancient One had sat. The fire still burned, warm and bright, fed by the ancient flames from beneath the mountain. Other giants had gathered there to mourn and remember, and they welcomed Thor among them without hesitation. Thor sat with them and shared their grief, for he had grown to respect the old giant in the time they had known each other. They spoke of the giant's wisdom and kindness, of the stories he had told, and the guidance he had given. They spoke of how he had known when to ask for help, and had the courage to reach out to an old enemy for the sake of his people. As the giants shared their memories, Thor realized something profound. The old giant had taught him just as much as Thor had helped the giant. The Ancient One had shown him that vulnerability was not weakness, that asking for help required its own kind of strength. He had demonstrated that true leadership meant putting the needs of others before pride or old grudges. Thor left Jotunheim that day with a heavy heart, but also with gratitude. He had known the old giant for only a brief moment in the long span of his life, but that moment had changed him in fundamental ways. The lessons he had learned would stay with him forever, shaping his choices and his actions for all the years to come. Time continued its inexorable flow. The world grew older, and the signs of the coming end became more apparent to those who knew how to read them. The gods felt it in the air, a sense of something building, something inevitable approaching from the distant future. But they did not speak of it often, preferring to focus on the present, on the work that needed to be done each day. Thor threw himself into this work with renewed dedication. He traveled more than ever, visiting all the realms, helping where help was needed, fighting when fighting was necessary, but always trying to leave things better than he found them. He knew that time was finite, even for gods, and he wanted to use his time well. He returned often to the world of humans, for they needed help more than most. They lived such short lives, burning bright and fast like candles in the wind. They faced dangers that would have destroyed them without the protection of the god. Thor walked among them, a guardian they could not see, a protector they did not know they had. And sometimes, when he found humans who were particularly brave or kind or wise, Thor would reveal himself to them. He would sit with them and talk with them, as he had once talked with the old giant. He would listen to their stories and share his own. He would learn from them, for humans had a way of seeing things clearly precisely, because their lives were so short, because they could not afford to waste time on things that did not matter. These encounters reminded Thor of why his work was important, why the gods existed in the first place. They were not meant to rule over others, or to demand worship or tribute. They were meant to protect and guide, to help the world flourish, to hold back the darkness that always pressed in from the edges of existence. In his travels, Thor also encountered other giants, descendants of those he had helped all those centuries ago. They recognized him, or recognized his hammer at least, and they greeted him with respect and gratitude. Some had questions for him, seeking advice or wisdom. Others simply wanted to thank him for what he had done, to tell him how their lives had been made better because of his choice to help rather than to harm. These meetings filled Thor with a quiet joy. He saw that his actions had rippled out through time, affecting not just one generation but many, creating possibilities that would not have existed otherwise. It was a different kind of victory than winning a battle, more subtle, but perhaps more lasting. One day, Thor stood on a high mountain in Jotunheim, looking out across the land. Below him, he could see valleys where giants tended their gardens, mountains where they had carved their homes, rivers that ran with water from melting glaciers. The land was harsh but beautiful, cold but alive. It was a testament to the resilience of the giants and to the power of the ancient fire that still burned beneath it all. Thor thought about all the years that had passed since he first climbed this mountain, since he first entered the hall of the old giant. He thought about how much he had changed, how much he had learned. He had been proud and fierce back then, certain of his strength and his righteousness. He was still proud and fierce, but now those qualities were tempered with wisdom and compassion, with an understanding of the complexity of the world. He lifted his hammer and felt its familiar weight, felt the warmth that still radiated from it. The hammer was a part of him now, more than it had ever been before. It carried the memory of the ancient fire, the legacy of a choice made in darkness, the proof that even the mightiest could learn and grow and change. Thor turned from the view and began to walk down the mountain. He had stayed long enough in Jotunheim. There were other places that needed him, other people who required his help. The work of a god was never finished, the duty of a protector never complete. But as he walked, Thor felt at peace. He knew who he was and what he was meant to do. He knew that he had made mistakes and would make more, that he had failed and would fail again, but that he would always try to do better, to be better, to choose compassion over cruelty and understanding over judgment. The path down the mountain was long but not difficult. Thor had walked it many times before, and would walk it many times again. Each step was familiar, each turn known. But familiarity did not breed boredom or contempt. Instead, it brought comfort, the comfort of returning to a place that held meaning, of following a path that led somewhere worth going. When Thor reached the base of the mountain, he found a group of young giants playing in the snow. They were children by giant standards, though each was still larger than a full-grown human. They built structures from ice and snow, creating castles and fortresses and great walls that they then knocked down with glee, only to build them again. The children did not notice Thor at first, too absorbed in their play. He stood and watched them for a while, smiling at that energy and creativity. They reminded him of his own children, of Modi and his brother Magni, of the days when they had been young and everything was new and exciting. Then, one of the children saw him and stopped playing. The others followed suit, falling silent as they stared at the god standing before them. Thor could see recognition dawning in their eyes. They knew who he was from the stories their parents and grandparents had told them. Thor smiled and greeted them kindly. He asked them about their game and listened as they explained the rules and the objective. Then, to their surprise and delight, he joined in their play. He helped them build a great fortress of snow and ice, using his strength to lift blocks they could not move, shaping the snow with his hands into walls and towers. The children laughed and shouted with joy, their earlier awe giving way to the simple pleasure of play. They forgot, for a moment, that Thor was a god, and saw him simply as a playmate, as someone who was willing to join in their fun. Thor, in turn, forgot for a moment the weight of his responsibilities and simply enjoyed the act of creation, of building something with others, of being part of a community, however, briefly. When the fortress was complete, the children stood back and admired their work. It was magnificent, tall and strong, with walls that gleamed in the sunlight and towers that reached toward the sky. They thanked Thor for his help, their voices full of genuine warmth and gratitude. Thor bid them farewell and continued on his way, but the memory of that afternoon stayed with him. It reminded him that not all his work had to be dramatic or world-changing. Sometimes the most important things were the small moments, the brief connections, the simple acts of kindness that brought joy to others. He traveled on through Jotunheim, making his way back toward the border with the lower world. As he walked, he noticed the signs of life all around him. Birds nested in the cracks of rocks, their songs echoing across the valleys. Small animals burrowed in the earth, gathering food for the winter that would come, but would not be as harsh as it once was. Plants grew in sheltered spots, their roots reaching deep to find the warmth that rose from below. All of this life existed because of the choice he had made all those years ago. Thor felt humbled by this realization. He had not set out to change the world, had not sought glory or recognition. He had simply seen a problem and tried to solve it, had heard a request for help and decided to respond. And from that one choice, all of this had flowed. It made him think about all the other choices he made every day, the decisions large and small that shaped the world around him. Each choice mattered. Each action had consequences that rippled out in ways he could not always predict or control. This was a weight to carry, but also a gift, for it meant that his life had meaning, that what he did made a difference. Thor reached the border of Jotunheim as the sun was setting. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, the colors reflected in the ice and snow, creating a landscape that looked like it was made of colored glass. He stopped and took a moment to appreciate the beauty of it, to let himself feel grateful for the world and all its wonders. Then he stepped across the border into the lower world, into the lands where humans lived and worked and died. The transition was subtle, just a slight change in the air, a small shift in the quality of the light. But Thor felt it, as he always did, the movement from one realm to another, the crossing of boundaries that most beings could not perceive. He walked through the world of humans, staying mostly unseen, a shadow among shadows. He watched them going about their lives, tending their farms and herds, building their homes and raising their children. They did not know he was there, but he was watching over them nonetheless, ready to help if help was needed, ready to defend if danger approached. Thor saw an old farmer struggling to fix a fence that had fallen in a storm. He stopped, and still unseen, used his strength to lift the broken posts and set them right. The farmer blinked in surprise as the fence suddenly stood upright, but he shrugged and went back to his work, attributing it to luck or to the gods watching over him. He was right about the latter, though he did not know how right. Further on, Thor found a young woman sitting by a stream, weeping. Her child was sick, and she had come to the water to wash clothes and to pray for help. Thor's heart went out to her, for he understood the pain of seeing a loved one suffer. He could not cure all illnesses or prevent all deaths, for that was beyond even the power of God. But he could offer comfort. He appeared to her, not in his full divine glory, but in a simpler form, as a traveler passing by. He asked her what troubled her, and she told him about her sick child, about her fears and her hopes. Thor listened with patience and compassion, and when she had finished, he gave her some herbs he had gathered in his travels, plants that would help ease the child's fever and pain. The woman thanked him with tears in her eyes, and Thor blessed her and her child before continuing on his way. He did not know if the child would survive or not, for fate was not his to command. But he had done what he could, had offered what help was in his power to give. Sometimes that was all anyone could do, god or mortal. As night fell, Thor found himself approaching a small village. He could see lights in the windows of the houses, could hear the sounds of people talking and laughing and living. He felt drawn to join them, to sit by their fires and share their company. So he entered the village as a traveler, and the people welcomed him as they welcomed all strangers, with food and drink and a place by the fire. He sat with them through the evening, listening to their stories and sharing some of his own, though he did not reveal who he truly was. They talked about their lives and their work, about the changing seasons and the old tradition. They told stories of the gods, including stories of Thor, and he listened with amusement and interest, hearing how the tales had changed and grown in the telling. One old man told a version of the story about Thor and the ancient fire, though many of the details were different from what had actually happened. In this version, Thor had fought a great ice dragon to reach the fire, and he had forged a new sun in the depths of the earth to warm Jotunheim. Thor smiled at the embellishments but did not correct them. Stories were meant to grow and change, to adapt to the needs and imaginations of those who told them. When the evening grew late and the fire burned low, Thor thanked his hosts and rose to leave. They offered him a place to sleep, but he declined, saying he needed to continue his journey. They bid him farewell and good fortune, and he stepped out into the night. The stars were bright overhead, and the air was cold but not bitter. Thor walked through the darkness, guided by his own internal sense of direction, by an instinct that never led him astray. He was heading back toward Asgard, back toward home, but he was in no hurry. The night was peaceful, and he wanted to savor it, to hold on to this feeling of connection and purpose. As he walked, Thor thought about all the lives that intersected with his own, all the people he had met and helped and learned from. Each person was a world unto themselves, with their own hopes and fears, their own stories and struggle. And he was just one thread in the vast tapestry of existence, important, but not more important than any other thread. This was perhaps the greatest lesson he had learned from the old giant, and from all his years of wandering and helping. He was not the center of the world, not the most important being in existence. He was simply one part of something much larger, something that included gods and giants and humans and all the other beings that filled the 9 realms. And his role in that larger thing was to protect and to serve, to use his strength not for his own glory, but for the benefit of all. It was a simple role, but not an easy one. It required constant vigilance, constant effort, constant choice to do what was right, rather than what was easy. Thor walked on through the night, his hammer at his side, his heart at peace. Eventually, he saw the shimmer of the Bifrost in the distance, the rainbow bridge that would carry him home. He approached it slowly, not wanting to rush, wanting to hold on to this moment of clarity and connection for as long as possible. When he stepped onto the bridge, the colors surrounded him, red and blue and green and gold, each shade singing its own note. He ascended slowly, looking back at the world below, at the forests and villages and mountains, spread out like a map beneath him. From this height, everything looked small and fragile, and yet he knew that within that smallness was infinite depth, infinite value. Heimdall was waiting at the top of the bridge, as he always was. The Guardian smiled at Thor, and Thor smiled back. No words passed between them, but understanding did. Heimdall had seen where Thor had been, and what he had done, and he approved. The Guardian stepped aside, and Thor walked past him into Asgard. The golden realm gleamed in the eternal light, beautiful and perfect as always. But Thor no longer felt intimidated by that perfection. He understood now that Asgard's beauty was not diminished by the roughness of Jotunheim, or the simplicity of the human world. Each realm had its own kind of beauty, its own value and meaning. Asgard was home, but it was not the only home, not the only place that mattered. Thor made his way to his hall, and entered its familiar warmth. He removed his cloak and his belt, and set his hammer on the table where it belonged. Then he sat by his own fire, and looked into the flames, seeing in them echoes of the ancient fire beneath Jotunheim, echoes of all the fires that burned throughout the 9 realms. He thought about the journey he had taken, both the physical journey to Jotunheim and the longer journey of growth and understanding that had continued over the year. He thought about the person he had been when he first entered the old giant's hall, and the person he was now. The changes were subtle but profound, like the way a river slowly carves new channels through stone. Sleep came to him gently that night, and with it came dreams. He dreamed of the ancient fire burning bright and eternal, of giants and gods living in peace, of humans flourishing under the protection of powers they did not fully understand, but benefited from nonetheless. He dreamed of a world where strength served wisdom and power served compassion. When he woke, it was to a new day in Asgard, a day full of possibility and purpose. Thor rose and dressed, and took up his hammer once more. There was work to be done, as there always was. There were threats to face and challenges to overcome. But he was ready, more ready than he had ever been, for he knew not just what he was fighting for, but why it mattered. The days that followed were full of activity. Thor received visits from other gods who needed his help or his counsel. He welcomed them all, listening to their concerns and offering what wisdom he could. Some came with reports of troubles in the other realms, of monsters that needed fighting or disasters that needed averting. Thor addressed each problem with patience and care, using not just his strength but his mind and his heart. He also spent time with his sons, teaching them what he had learned about being a god and a protector. Modi and Magni were growing into fine warriors, strong and brave like their father. But Thor wanted them to be more than just warriors. He wanted them to understand the responsibility that came with power, the importance of compassion and wisdom alongside strength. He told them stories from his travels, including the story of the ancient fire. He explained how he had learned that the greatest victories were not always won in battle, that sometimes the most heroic act was to help rather than to harm. His sons listened carefully, absorbing these lessons, slowly growing into the kind of gods the world would need. The seasons turned once more, bringing spring to the realms. The snow melted, revealing the earth beneath. Plants pushed up through the soil, reaching toward the sun. Animals emerged from their winter dens, blinking in the bright light. Life renewed itself, as it always did, in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, ending and beginning. Thor walked through the gardens of Asgard, watching the flowers bloom and feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He thought about cycles, about how the world moved in patterns that repeated but were never quite the same. Each spring was like the last spring, but also unique, carrying its own particular character and flavor. In this way, he realized, his own life was like the season. He had gone through cycles of growth and rest, of activity and reflection. He had been young and reckless, then older and wiser, and he would continue to change and develop for as long as he existed. This was not something to fear, but something to embrace, for it meant he was alive, truly alive, not static or frozen, but dynamic and evolving. One afternoon, Thor received a visitor he had not expected. A young giant came to Asgard, traveling across the realms with a message. The giant was nervous, clearly uncomfortable in the realm of the gods, but determined to fulfill the task given to him. Thor greeted the young giant kindly and invited him to sit and share food and drink. The giant relaxed slightly at this treatment. Surprised by the warmth of his reception, he had expected hostility, or at least coldness, but Thor treated him like an honored guest, with respect and genuine interest. When the giant felt comfortable enough to speak, he delivered his message. It came from the new leader of the giants in Jotunheim, who had taken the place of the old one who had passed away. The message was one of gratitude and friendship, an acknowledgement of all that Thor had done, and a promise of peace between gods and giants for as long as the new leader lived. Thor accepted the message with humility and grace. He told the young giant to carry back his own message, one of respect and mutual understanding. He said that the gods did not seek to rule over the giants, or to impose their will on Jotunheim. He said that both gods and giants were children of the same world, and that they could choose to be enemies or neighbors, and that he preferred the latter. The young giant listened to these words with wide eyes, clearly moved by them. When Thor finished speaking, the giant bowed deeply, then rose and made his way back toward the Bifrost. Thor watched him go, feeling satisfied with the exchange. Each small step toward peace and understanding was valuable. Each bridge built between old enemies was a victory worth celebrating. Time continued its endless flow, and Thor continued his work. He fought when fighting was necessary, protecting the realms from threats that would have destroyed them. But he also healed and helped and built, using his power for creation as much as for destruction. He became known not just as a warrior, but as a protector in the fullest sense. Someone who defended not just against physical threats, but against hunger and cold and despair. The humans in particular came to see Thor as their special guardian. They built shrines to him in their villages and told stories about him around their fires. They prayed to him when storms threatened their crops and thanked him when the weather was favorable. And though Thor could not answer every prayer or prevent every disaster, he did what he could, watching over the humans with care and concern. In Jotunheim, the giants also remembered Thor, though they showed their gratitude in different ways. They carved his image in ice and stone, creating monuments that would last for generations. They named mountains and valleys after him, marking the landscape with reminders of what he had done. And they taught their children to respect the gods, especially Thor, showing that old enemies could become allies when respect and understanding replaced fear and hatred. The elves and dwarves, too, came to know Thor better through his travels. The elves appreciated his straightforward nature, his honesty and directness in a world where so much was complicated and subtle. The dwarves respected his craftsmanship and his appreciation for well-made things, for Thor understood the value of good work and the skill required to create something that would last. Slowly, over years and decades and centuries, Thor became a bridge between the realms, a figure who was known and respected in all the different worlds that made up existence. He was not just a god of thunder anymore, but something more, a symbol of the possibility of unity and understanding across differences. One day, Thor stood on a high cliff in Midgard, the world of humans, looking out at the ocean. The waves rolled in endlessly, crashing against the rocks below, sending up spray that caught the sunlight and created temporary rainbows. The sight was beautiful and humbling, a reminder of the power and persistence of nature. Thor thought about water and how it shaped the world. Water was soft, yielding, seemingly weak compared to stone. And yet, over time, water carved through the hardest rock, creating valleys and canyons, reshaping the landscape in ways that no amount of force could achieve. The ocean wore away at the cliffs, the rivers cut through mountains, and the rain smoothed the roughest surfaces. There was a lesson in this, Thor realized. Persistence and patience could achieve what force alone never could. The work he did, the small acts of kindness and help, the bridges built between peoples, the moments of understanding shared, these were like water on stone. Each individual act might seem insignificant, but over time they added up, creating real and lasting change. This realization filled Thor with renewed purpose. He did not need to accomplish everything at once, or to solve every problem immediately. He just needed to keep working, keep trying, keep choosing compassion and understanding over anger and violence. The results might not be visible right away, but they would come in time, like the canyon carved by the persistent river. Thor turned from the ocean and began to walk inland, back toward human settlements where his help might be needed. As he walked, he noticed the small things, the flowers growing in the grass, the birds singing in the trees, the clouds drifting across the sky. These were the details that made up the world, the tiny pieces that together created the larger whole. He found a village where sickness had struck, and he stayed to help. He could not cure the disease, for that was beyond his power, but he could comfort the sick and encourage the healers. He could use his knowledge of herbs and remedies, learned over long years of travel. He could provide strength and hope when both were in short supply. For days, Thor worked alongside the village healers, tending the sick and helping where he could. Some recovered and some did not, for such was the nature of illness and the limits of even divine power. But those who recovered did so with Thor's help, and those who died did so with comfort and dignity, surrounded by care rather than abandoned to suffering. When the crisis had passed and the village began to return to normal life, the people wanted to thank Thor, but he asked for no thanks, no payment, no shrine or monument. He simply asked that they remember what they had learned, that they care for each other as they had been cared for, that they pass on the kindness they had received. Then he left the village and continued his wandering, following the paths that called to him, going where he sensed he was needed. Sometimes this took him to places of conflict, where he had to fight to protect the innocent. Other times it took him to places of quiet suffering, where his presence alone was enough to bring comfort. And sometimes it took him simply to beautiful places, where he could rest and reflect, and remember why the world was worth protecting. Years passed in this way, with Thor traveling and helping and learning. He grew not older in body, but deeper in spirit, accumulating wisdom, the way the earth accumulates layers of sediment. Slowly but steadily, each experience added to his understanding. Each encounter taught him something new about the world and about himself. He returned to Jotunheim periodically, always welcomed by the giants who remembered what he had done. He saw how the land continued to thrive, how the ancient fire still burned bright beneath the mountains, spreading warmth through the frozen realm. He saw new generations of giants who had never known the terrible cold that had threatened to destroy their people, who took the warmth for granted the way all young beings take for granted the gifts of those who came before. This did not bother Thor. In fact, it pleased him. The point of his help had not been to be remembered or honored, but to solve a problem, to prevent suffering. If the young giants did not remember the crisis, because it had been solved before they were born, that was success, not failure. The best help was the kind that became invisible, the kind that allowed people to live normal lives without constant awareness of the disasters that had been averted. In Asgard, Thor's hall became a place where beings from all realms could come for help or counsel. Gods and giants, elves and dwarves, humans and others, all found welcome there. Thor listened to their concerns and offered what aid he could, using his strength when strength was needed, but more often using his wisdom and his connections to find peaceful solutions to problems. The other gods noticed the change in Thor, the way he had matured and grown beyond his early reputation as simply a mighty warrior. Odin, in particular, watched his son with satisfaction, for he could see that Thor was becoming the kind of god the world needed, someone who combined strength with wisdom, power with compassion. The All-Father knew that difficult times lay ahead, that the world would face challenges that would test even the gods. He was glad that Thor would be ready when those times came. One evening, as Thor sat in his hall by the fire, Odin came to visit. The All-Father sat beside his son, and they talked long into the night about many things. They spoke of the past and the future, of the nature of power and the responsibility of leadership. They discussed the balance between different forces in the world, between order and chaos, between safety and freedom, between preservation and change. Odin told Thor that he was proud of him, proud not just of his strength and his victories in battle, but of the person he had become. He said that true greatness was not found in dominance or conquest, but in service and protection, in using power to help rather than to harm. He said that Thor had learned this lesson well, and that his actions had made the world better and safer for all its inhabitants. Thor listened to his father's words with quiet gratitude. He had not sought praise or approval, but receiving it from Odin, whose opinion he valued above almost all others, meant more than he could easily express. He thanked his father simply and honestly, acknowledging the role that Odin's guidance had played in his growth. After Odin left, Thor remained by the fire for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened since that first journey to Jotunheim. He thought about how one choice, one decision to help instead of ignore, had led to so many other changes, creating ripples that spread out through time and space, touching countless lives in ways both large and small. He looked at his hammer, resting on the table beside him, glowing faintly with the warmth of the ancient fire it still carried within. The hammer was a reminder of that choice, and of all the choices that had followed. It was a symbol of his commitment to protect and serve, to use his power not for himself, but for others. Thor picked up the hammer and felt its familiar weight, its comfortable warmth. He knew that he would carry it for as long as he lived, that it would be his companion through whatever adventures and challenges lay ahead, and he knew that it would always remind him of the most important lesson he had learned. That true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to help and to heal. The fire burned low, and eventually Thor rose and prepared for sleep. He lay down on his bed, the hammer beside him as always, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, bringing with it dreams of mountains and ice, of fire and warmth, of giants and gods living in peace, of a world balanced and whole. In the morning, Thor woke refreshed and ready for a new day. He rose and dressed, and took up his hammer, then stepped out into the golden light of Asgard. The realm was beautiful as always, but now Thor saw it with new eyes, eyes that appreciated its beauty, while also recognizing that it was just one kind of beauty among many, one part of a larger and more complex whole. He walked through the streets of Asgard, greeting the other gods he encountered, stopping to talk with some and exchange news. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits, for it was a time of peace and prosperity in all the realm. The threats that always lurked at the edges of existence seemed distant, and there was a feeling of optimism in the air. Thor knew better than to trust this feeling completely. He'd lived long enough to understand that peace was always temporary, that challenges would come again, as they always had. But he also knew that this moment of peace was precious and should be enjoyed while it lasted. There would be time enough for fighting when fighting was needed. For now, it was enough to walk in the sun and feel grateful for the world and all its wonders. As he walked, Thor passed the training grounds, where young gods practiced their skills with weapons and magic. He stopped to watch for a while, observing their techniques and their progress. Some of them noticed him watching and called out greetings, which he returned warmly. One young goddess, bold and curious, approached and asked if he would spar with her, wanting to test her skills against the famous Thor. Thor agreed readily, for he enjoyed the challenge of a good sparring match and wanted to encourage the next generation of gods. They faced each other in the practice ring, and the young goddess attacked with speed and cleverness, trying to use agility to overcome Thor's greater strength. Thor defended himself with skill born of countless battles, but he also held back, using only as much force as was necessary to make the match interesting without risking injury. The match went on for some time, with neither gaining a clear advantage. The young goddess was skilled and determined, and Thor found himself having to work harder than he had expected. Eventually, she made a clever feint that caught him off guard, and she managed to land a blow that would have been serious if they had been fighting in earnest. Thor acknowledged the hit with a laugh and a bow, conceding the match to her. The young goddess beamed with pride, and the other young gods who had been watching cheered and congratulated her. Thor praised her skill and her ingenuity, encouraging her to continue training and developing her abilities. As he left the training grounds, Thor reflected on the encounter with satisfaction. The new generation of gods was strong and capable, ready to take up the mantle of protection when the time came. He did not need to carry the burden alone, did not need to be the only protector. There were others who could and would help, and that was as it should be. Thor continued his walk, eventually finding himself at the edge of Asgard, where the Golden Realm gave way to the open sky. He stood at this boundary and looked out at the other realms visible in the distance, faint shapes on the horizon that represented different worlds, different ways of being. He thought about the connections between these realms, about how they were separate but also linked, how what happened in one affected the other. He thought about his role as someone who moved between these realms, who served as a bridge and a guardian. It was a role he had not chosen, but had grown into, and he was grateful for it gave his life meaning and purpose. A voice spoke behind him, and Thor turned to find Frigg, his mother, approaching. She was beautiful and wise, her presence calming and reassuring. She came to stand beside him, looking out at the same view, sharing the moment in comfortable silence. After a while, Frigg spoke, asking Thor what he was thinking about. He told her about the young goddess and the sparring match, about his thoughts on the new generation and the future. Frigg listened with the patience of a mother who has heard many such thoughts from her children, who understands that sometimes people need to speak their thoughts aloud to make sense of them. When Thor finished, Frigg told him that she was proud of him, not just for his strength or his accomplishments, but for the person he had become. She said that she had watched him grow from a hot-headed young god into someone who understood the true meaning of power and responsibility. She said that he had learned lessons that many gods never learned, that he developed a wisdom that would serve him well in the difficult times that lay ahead. Thor thanked his mother for her words and for her support over the years. He told her that much of what he had learned came from watching her, from seeing how she dealt with challenges and conflicts, how she used wisdom and patience rather than force whenever possible. Frigg smiled at this, pleased that her example had been useful, that her lessons had been learned. They stood together for a while longer, mother and son, sharing the view and each other's company. Then Frigg took her leave, returning to her own responsibilities, and Thor was alone again with his thoughts. He decided to take another journey, to travel once more through the realms and see what had changed since his last visit. He made his way to the Bifrost and found Heimdall at his post. The guardian greeted him warmly and asked where he was going. Thor said he was not entirely sure, that he would wander and see where his path led him. Heimdall nodded in understanding and opened the way for him. Thor stepped onto the rainbow bridge and began his descent, leaving Asgard behind once more. The colors swirled around him, beautiful and strange, a reminder that the world was full of wonders for those who took the time to notice them. He emerged in the world of humans, in a forest he had not visited before. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft green light. The forest floor was covered with moss and ferns, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Thor walked through this forest with no particular destination in mind, simply enjoying the beauty and peace of it. He followed deer trails and streams, climbing over fallen logs and ducking under low branches. He felt like a child again, exploring a new place with fresh eyes and an open heart. He came upon a clearing where a spring bubbled up from the earth, forming a small pool of crystal clear water. Thor knelt beside the pool and drank, finding the water cold and refreshing. As he drank, he saw his reflection in the water, his face looking back at him from the still surface. The face he saw was his own, but also somehow different, marked by years of experience and growth. He could see the wisdom in his eyes, the lines around his mouth that came from smiling and laughing, the few strands of silver in his beard. He looked like someone who had lived and learned, who had faced challenges and overcome them, who had grown into the fullness of his potential. Thor rose from the spring and continued his walk, following a path that led out of the clearing and deeper into the forest. As he walked, he thought about identity and change, about how he was both the same person he had always been, and also completely different, transformed by his experiences and choices. This paradox did not trouble him. He understood that change was natural and necessary, that staying the same meant stagnating. He was glad to be who he was now, even though it meant letting go of who he had been. Growth required sacrifice, but the sacrifice was worth it for what was gained. The forest eventually gave way to open country, rolling hills covered with grass and wildflowers. Thor walked through this landscape, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the smell of the flowers. He saw farmers working in distant fields and herds of cattle grazing on the hillside. Everything spoke of life and abundance, of a world that was thriving and healthy. Thor felt a deep satisfaction at this sight. This was what he worked for, what he fought to protect. Not the glory or the honor, but these simple scenes of ordinary life continuing uninterrupted, people and animals going about their business in safety and peace. He came to a small town nestled in a valley between hills. It was market day, and the town square was full of people buying and selling goods, talking and laughing, going about their daily routine. Thor walked through the market, looking at the stalls and watching the people, feeling glad to be among them even if they did not know who he was. An old woman selling bread caught his eye and beckoned to him, offering him a loaf still warm from the oven. Thor approached and accepted the bread, paying her with a coin from his pouch. The bread was delicious, simple, but made with skill and care. He ate it as he walked, savoring each bite, thinking that sometimes the simplest pleasures were the most satisfying. He left the town and continued his wandering, crossing the hills and following whatever paths interested him. He passed through villages and farms, through wild places where no humans lived, through meadows and forests and along rivers. He saw the world in all its variety, all its complexity and beauty. Sometimes, he stopped to help where help was needed. He pulled a cart out of a ditch for a merchant whose horse could not manage it alone. He mended a broken fence for a farmer who was too old to do it himself. He rescued a child who had fallen into a well, lifting the small body to safety with gentle strength. These were small deeds, barely worth noting, but Thor knew that to those he helped, they meant everything. Days passed in this way, then weeks. Thor lost track of time, not because he forgot, but because it ceased to matter. He was simply present in each moment, doing what needed to be done, enjoying what could be enjoyed, learning what could be learned. Eventually, his wandering brought him back to the mountains, though not the mountains of Jotunheim, but rather the mountains in the world of humans. These were smaller than the giants' peaks, but still impressive, rising toward the sky with majesty and power. Thor decided to climb one of these mountains, drawn by the desire to see the world from a high place, to gain perspective and clarity. The climb was long and steep, but Thor ascended with the ease of long practice. He passed through different zones as he climbed, from the forested lower slopes through areas of scrub and grass, and finally to the bare rock near the summit. The air grew colder and thinner, but Thor barely noticed, for his divine nature protected him from such discomforts. He reached the summit as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. From this height, he could see for miles in every direction, could see forests and fields and rivers stretching to the horizon. He could see towns and villages scattered across the landscape, like seeds planted in fertile soil. He could see the smoke from 1,000 hearth fires rising into the evening air. Thor sat on a rock near the summit and watched the sun sink toward the horizon, watched the sky go from gold to orange to red to purple. The world below him grew darker as night approached, but the towns and villages began to glow with their own lights, candles, and fires creating warm spots in the gathering darkness. Looking at this scene, Thor felt a profound sense of connection to the world and all its inhabitants. Each of those lights represented people living their lives, families gathering for evening meals, children being put to bed, old ones sitting by fires and telling stories. Each light was a small miracle, a testament to the persistence of life and hope, even in a world that could be harsh and dangerous. And he was part of it all, connected to each of those lives, even if they did not know it. His work, his choices, his efforts to protect and help, all of it mattered because it allowed those lights to keep burning, allowed those lives to continue, allowed the world to remain a place where hope and love could flourish. The stars began to appear overhead, first one or two, and then hundreds and thousands, filling the sky with their cold light. Thor lay back on the rock and looked up at them, at the vast expanse of space and time they represented. He thought about how small he was in the grand scheme of things, how even a god was tiny compared to the immensity of creation. But he also thought about how size was not what mattered, how the value of a life or an action was not measured by scale. A single act of kindness, a single moment of compassion, could ripple out and affect countless other moments, countless other lives. What mattered was not being large but being good, not being powerful but being helpful, not being remembered but making a difference. These thoughts filled Thor with peace and contentment. He understood his place in the world, understood what he was meant to do and why it mattered. He felt no need for greater glory or higher status. He was content to be what he was, a protector and a helper, a bridge between realms, a force for good in a complicated world. He spent the night on that mountain summit, sleeping under the stars, his hammer beside him and the world spread out below. He dreamed of nothing, or perhaps of everything, resting deeply and completely, recharging his spirit for whatever challenges lay ahead. When morning came, Thor rose and began his descent. The world below was waking up, starting another day, and he wanted to be part of it, wanted to continue his work and his wandering. He climbed down through the zones of rock and grass and forest, returning to the lowlands where humans lived and worked. At the base of the mountain, he found a road and began to follow it, not knowing or caring where it led. He was simply moving forward, putting one foot in front of the other, trusting that the path would reveal itself as he walked. This was how he lived now, with trust and openness, with willingness to go wherever he was needed. The road led him through farmland, through small villages, through areas of wild forest. He walked for days, stopping when he found places that interested him or people who needed help. He was in no hurry, had no urgent destination. He was simply present, simply available, simply being Thor in all the ways that meant. One afternoon, the road brought him to a river, wide and fast-flowing. There was a bridge, but it had been damaged by recent floods, with several planks missing and the structure looking unstable. On the far side of the river, Thor could see a group of people waiting, clearly wanting to cross but afraid to risk the damaged bridge. Thor examined the bridge carefully, assessing the damage and the risk. The structure was indeed unstable, likely to collapse if too much weight was placed on it. But it could be repaired, and he had the skill and strength to do so. He called out to the people on the far side, telling them to wait while he fixed the bridge. Then he set to work, using his hammer and his hands to remove the damaged sections and replace them with new wood. He worked carefully but quickly, his divine strength making the work easier than it would have been for a human. As he worked, more people gathered on both sides of the river, watching the stranger repair their bridge. Some recognized something special about him, sensing that he was more than he appeared. Others simply appreciated the help, grateful that someone was solving a problem that affected them all. When the bridge was repaired and Thor had tested its strength, he waved for the people to cross. They did so carefully at first, then with growing confidence as they realized the bridge was solid and safe. As each person crossed, they thanked Thor, some with words and some with simple nods of gratitude. Thor accepted their thanks with humility, brushing off their praise and saying he had only done what anyone would have done. But they insisted that not everyone would have stopped, that not everyone would have had the skill or strength to make the repair. They wanted to know his name, wanted to honor him somehow. Thor smiled and told them his name, but asked for no honor or payment. He said that their safe crossing was reward enough, that seeing the bridge restored to usefulness was satisfaction in itself. Then, before they could insist further, he continued on his way, crossing the bridge himself and disappearing down the road on the far side. Behind him, he heard the people talking in wondering tones, realizing who he had been, understanding that a god had walked among them and helped them with their simple problem. The story would be told and retold, growing in the telling, becoming part of the local legend. But Thor did not stay to hear it. He was already moving on to whatever came next, to whatever other needs he might meet along the way. The days and weeks and months blended together in a pleasant rhythm of travel and work and rest. Thor continued his wandering, moving through the world of humans like a benevolent wind, touching lives and moving on. He helped where help was needed, protected where protection was required, and learned wherever learning was possible. Each day brought new experiences, new encounters, new opportunities to make a difference. This thought led him to reflect on his own life and how he had changed over the years. In his youth, he had burned bright and hot, full of passion and fury, eager to prove himself and to fight any challenge. Now he burned more steadily, with a warmth that was sustainable, that could last for ages without burning out. He had learned to pace himself, to conserve his energy for when it was truly needed, to find satisfaction in small victories as well as large ones. One day, Thor's wandering brought him to a monastery, a place where humans devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation. He had visited such places before and found them peaceful and restful, places where the noise of the world fell away and deeper thoughts could emerge. The monks welcomed him as they welcomed all travelers, offering him food and a place to sleep. They asked no questions about who he was or where he was going, respecting the privacy that wanderers often sought. Thor appreciated this and settled into the rhythm of the monastery, rising early for morning prayers, working in the gardens during the day, and sitting in meditation in the evening. During his time there, Thor talked with the abbot, an old man who had spent his entire adult life in service to his understanding of the divine. The abbot was wise in his own way, having gained insight through decades of prayer and reflection. He spoke of compassion and service, of the importance of putting others before oneself, of finding peace in simplicity. Thor listened to these words and found them resonating with his own understanding. Though the abbot spoke from a human perspective and used different language, the truths he spoke were the same truths Thor had learned through his own journey. Wisdom, it seemed, was universal, found by all who sought it sincerely regardless of their path. The abbot, in turn, was intrigued by Thor, sensing something unusual about this traveler, though not understanding exactly what. He asked Thor about his life and his philosophy, and Thor shared what he felt comfortable sharing, speaking of service and protection, of the responsibility that came with power, of the importance of compassion. Their conversations ranged over many topics, from the nature of good and evil to the meaning of sacrifice, from the relationship between power and humility to the balance between action and contemplation. Each man learned from the other, bridging the gap between divine and human understanding, finding common ground in their shared commitment to making the world better. After several days, Thor prepared to leave the monastery and continue his journey. The abbot walked with him to the gate, and they stood together in the morning light, two old souls sharing a moment of understanding and friendship. The abbot blessed Thor, asking his god to watch over the traveler and guide his steps. Thor accepted the blessing with grace and returned it in his own way, calling down protection and peace upon the monastery and all who lived there. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the quiet sanctuary behind and returning to the wider world. As he walked, Thor thought about the time he had spent in the monastery and the conversations he had shared with the abbot. He felt enriched by the experience, his understanding deepened by seeing familiar truths expressed in new ways. This was one of the great gifts of travel and openness, the ability to learn from everyone and everything, to gather wisdom from all sources rather than assuming any one path held all the answers. The road led Thor through mountains and valleys, through towns and wilderness. Summer had arrived in the world, bringing warmth and abundance. The fields were green with growing crops. The trees were full of leaves and fruit, and everywhere life flourished in the generous sunlight. Thor walked through this landscape with a grateful heart, appreciating the beauty and the vitality of it all. He stopped often to rest in pleasant spots, sitting beneath shade trees or beside cool streams, simply being present and enjoying the world around him. One afternoon, he came upon a group of children playing in a meadow, running and laughing in the sunshine. Thor stopped to watch them, smiling at their joy and energy. They played simple games, chasing each other and making up rules as they went, completely absorbed in the moment without worry about past or future. Watching them, Thor remembered his own children and the times he had played with them when they were young. He remembered Modi and Magni as boys, full of energy and curiosity, eager to explore the world and learn everything they could. They were grown now, strong gods in their own right, but he still saw them sometimes as those eager children, and the memory filled him with warmth. One of the children noticed Thor watching and called out to him, inviting him to join their game. Thor accepted gladly, setting aside his hammer and his divine dignity to run and play with the children. They laughed at seeing an adult willing to be silly and playful, and they included him in their games without reservation. For an hour, Thor was simply another player, running and hiding and seeking, laughing and shouting, with the same abandon as the children. He let himself forget about responsibilities and duties, about the weight of the world and the challenges ahead. He was just present, just playing, just being joyful. Eventually, the children had to go home for their evening meal, and Thor bid them farewell. They waved goodbye enthusiastically, already planning what games they would play the next time they saw him, not knowing that he would be far away by then, continuing his endless journey through the realm. Thor picked up his hammer and continued walking, feeling lighter and happier than he had in a long time. The children had reminded him of something important, something he sometimes forgot in the seriousness of his work. Joy was not frivolous or unimportant. It was essential, a vital part of what made life worth living and protecting. As evening fell, Thor found himself approaching a large town, bigger than the villages he had been passing through. He could see lights beginning to glow in windows, and hear the sounds of people finishing their day's work and gathering for the evening. He decided to find an inn and stay the night, to sleep in a bed rather than under the stars for once. The inn was warm and welcoming, full of travelers and locals sharing food and drink and conversation. Thor found a spot at a long table and ordered a meal, settling in to eat and listen to the talk around him. People discussed their lives and their work, the state of the crops and the weather, local gossip and news from distant places. Thor listened without contributing much, content to observe and learn. He heard stories of kindness and cruelty, of triumph and tragedy, of all the small dramas that made up human life. Each story was a window into a different world, a different way of seeing and being, and he appreciated them all. After the meal, a bard began to play and sing, entertaining the crowd with songs and stories. Some of the songs were about the gods, including several about Thor himself. He listened with amusement and interest, hearing how his deeds had been transformed into legend, how the reality of his actions had been shaped by imagination and time into something both true and not true. In one song, he was portrayed as purely fierce and warlike, seeking battle wherever he could find it. In another, he was wise and thoughtful, solving problems with cleverness rather than force. Both versions captured some truth about him, but neither was complete. He was both those things and more, a complex being who could not be reduced to simple characterization. When the bard finished, people called for more songs, and the music continued late into the night. Thor eventually retired to his room, climbed into the bed, and fell asleep to the sound of singing and laughter drifting up from below. He dreamed that night of all the places he had been, and all the people he had met. In his dreams, they were all connected, all part of a vast web that spanned the realms and tied everything together. He saw how each small action rippled outward, affecting things far beyond what could be seen or predicted. And he saw that he was just one thread in this web, important, but not more important than any other thread, all of them necessary to hold the whole together. When he woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and he could hear birds singing outside. Thor rose and prepared for another day of travel, gathering his things and taking up his hammer. He paid the innkeeper and stepped out into the morning, ready for whatever the day might bring. The town was busy with morning activity, people opening shops and going about their business. Thor walked through the streets, observing the life of the town, seeing how each person played their role in the larger community. There was the baker providing bread, the blacksmith making tools, the teacher instructing children, the healer tending the sick. Each role was important, each person contributing to the whole in their own way. Thor left the town and returned to the open road, following it wherever it led. The morning was beautiful, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of summer flowers. He walked with a steady pace, covering miles without effort, his divine stamina making long journeys easy. By midday, he reached a crossroads where 3 roads met. Thor paused here, considering which direction to take. Each road led somewhere different, to different lands and different possibilities. In the end, he chose the middle road, following an instinct that told him this was the right path for now. The road climbed into hills covered with oak and ash trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead that provided welcome shade from the summer sun. Thor walked through this dappled light, enjoying the coolness and the quiet. The forest was alive, with birds and small animals, all going about their lives, untroubled by his passing. He came upon a clearing where an old woman sat beside a small cottage, working at a spinning wheel. She looked up as Thor approached and greeted him warmly, inviting him to rest and share some water from her well. Thor accepted gratefully, for even gods appreciated kindness and hospitality. The old woman asked where he was traveling, and Thor said he was simply wandering, going wherever his path led him. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, and said that she too had been a wanderer in her youth, seeing much of the world before settling in this quiet place. They talked for a while about travel and the places they had seen. The old woman told stories of her adventures, of mountains she had climbed, and rivers she had crossed, of people she had met, and things she had learned. Thor listened with genuine interest, for he knew that everyone had wisdom to share if you took the time to listen. In return, Thor shared some of his own stories, carefully edited to hide his divine nature, but still true in their essence. He spoke of helping people in need, of seeing the beauty of different lands, of learning that the world was full of wonders for those who opened their eyes to see them. The old woman smiled and said that he sounded like someone who understood what was truly important in life. She said that too many people spent their lives chasing things that did not matter, like wealth or fame or power, forgetting that the real treasures were simpler, things like kindness and beauty and connection. Thor agreed wholeheartedly with this wisdom, recognizing in her words a truth he had learned through his own long experience. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, simply enjoying the peace of the clearing and each other's company. Eventually, Thor rose to continue his journey, thanking the old woman for her hospitality and her wisdom. She wished him well and said she hoped his path would be filled with good fortune. Thor walked away, feeling enriched by the encounter, reminded once again that wisdom was not the exclusive property of gods or monks, but could be found in anyone who had lived thoughtfully and well. The road descended from the hills into a wide plain where fields of grain stretched to the horizon. It was harvest time, and Thor could see workers in the fields, cutting the grain and gathering it into sheaves. The work was hard and hot, but the workers sang as they labored, their voices carrying across the fields in simple, rhythmic songs. Thor stopped at the edge of one field and watched the harvest for a while. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing food being gathered, seeing the results of a season's work coming to fruition. These workers were feeding their communities, providing the sustenance that would carry people through the coming winter. It was humble work, but essential, as important in its way as anything Thor did. One of the workers noticed Thor watching and waved, calling out an invitation to join them if he wanted to earn some coin. Thor considered this, and then agreed, setting down his hammer and walking out into the field to help with the harvest. He worked alongside the humans for the rest of the afternoon, cutting grain with a sickle and binding it into sheaves. The work was repetitive, but somehow satisfying, allowing his mind to rest while his body moved in familiar patterns. He enjoyed being part of the team, working toward a common goal, sharing the labor and the companionship. The workers were curious about him, this stranger who had joined them without explanation. They asked him questions during the brief breaks they took for water and rest. Thor answered vaguely, saying he was a traveler passing through, looking for honest work. They accepted this explanation readily enough, for wandering workers were common during harvest time. As the sun began to set, the day's work ended, and the workers gathered their tools and headed toward a nearby farmhouse where they would be fed. They invited Thor to join them, and he accepted, helping to carry some of the tools and sheaves. The meal was simple but abundant: bread and cheese and vegetables, washed down with cool water and weak beer. The workers ate with good appetite, tired from their labor, but satisfied with what they had accomplished. They talked and joked with each other, the camaraderie of people who had worked hard together. Thor ate with them and listened to their talk, learning about their lives and concerns. They worried about the weather, and whether the harvest would be good enough to see them through winter. They talked about their families and their homes, about children who needed feeding and old parents who needed care. They spoke of hopes and fears, of dreams and practical realities. These conversations reminded Thor of why his work mattered. These people lived on the edge, where a bad harvest or a harsh winter could mean suffering or death. They needed the world to be safe and stable, needed the natural cycles to continue uninterrupted, needed protection from threats they could not defend against themselves. And that was what Thor provided, the stability and safety that allowed ordinary life to continue. When the meal ended, the workers offered to share their sleeping quarters with Thor, but he declined politely, saying he preferred to sleep outside. He thanked them for the food and the work and the company, then walked away into the gathering darkness. He found a spot at the edge of the field where an old oak tree stood, its massive trunk and spreading branches creating a natural shelter. Thor settled himself at the base of the tree, his back against the rough bark, his hammer across his knees. He looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and felt at peace. This was a good life, he thought. Not glamorous or heroic in the ways stories made things seem, but meaningful and real. He was making a difference, helping where help was needed, protecting what needed protection. He was living in alignment with his values and his purpose. And that was all anyone could ask for, God or mortal. Thor closed his eyes and let sleep come, drifting into dreams of fields and harvests, of simple work and simple satisfaction. He dreamed of a world where everyone had enough, where labor was rewarded fairly, where no one went hungry or cold. It was a dream he knew might never be fully realized, but it was worth working toward, worth striving for even if perfect success was impossible. In the morning, Thor woke to find dew on the grass and birds singing in the oak tree above him. He rose and stretched, feeling refreshed despite having slept on the ground. He picked up his hammer and began walking, leaving the fields and the farmhouse behind, continuing his endless journey through the world. Days turned into weeks, and Thor's wandering continued. He crossed rivers and forests, mountains and plains. He stopped in towns and villages, helping where he could, learning what he could, always moving forward. Sometimes he revealed his identity, and sometimes he remained anonymous, depending on what the situation required. He began to notice that autumn was approaching, subtle signs in the angle of the sunlight and the coolness of the morning. Leaves were starting to change color at the edges, green fading to yellow and gold. Birds were gathering in flocks, preparing for their long migrations to warmer lands. The world was preparing for another turn of the cycle, another descent into winter and dormancy before the eventual return of spring. Thor thought about cycles and seasons, about how everything in the world moved in patterns that repeated endlessly, but were never quite the same. Each autumn was like every other autumn, but also unique, with its own particular character. And so it was with his life. Cycles of action and rest, of adventure and reflection, each cycle similar to the last, but never identical. One day, as Thor walked through a forest blazing with autumn colors, he sensed something unusual ahead. There was a disturbance in the natural flow of things, a wrongness that his divine senses could detect. He quickened his pace, following the feeling to its source. He emerged from the forest into a valley where a village should have been, but instead found only ruins. The houses had been burned, the fields trampled, everything destroyed. Thor walked through the devastation with a heavy heart, seeing the signs of violence and chaos. This had been a deliberate attack, not a natural disaster. He searched the ruins carefully, looking for survivors, but found none. The villagers had either fled or been killed, and whatever force had destroyed this place had moved on. Thor knelt in the center of what had been the village square and touched the scorched earth, reading the traces of what had happened. He saw in his mind monsters from the wild places, creatures of chaos and destruction that sometimes emerged to attack human settlement. They had come in the night, overwhelming the village's defenses, leaving only ruin in their wake. The villagers had fought bravely, but had been no match for such savage strength. Thor stood and looked around at the destruction, feeling anger rising within him. This was the kind of threat he existed to combat, the kind of evil that preyed on the innocent and the weak. He would find these monsters and deal with them, ensuring they never attacked another village. Following the traces left by the monsters, Thor began tracking them through the wilderness. The trail led deep into the mountains, into areas where humans rarely went. Thor followed it tirelessly, his anger giving him focus and determination. This was the other side of his role as protector. Not the gentle helping, but the fierce defending. Not the patient teaching, but the righteous punishment. For 3 days, he tracked the monsters, following them through caves and ravines, across streams and over ridges. The trail grew fresher as he got closer, until finally, on the evening of the 3rd day, he found their lair, a deep cave hidden in a remote valley. Thor approached the cave carefully, aware that monsters could be cunning as well as strong. He could hear them inside, grunting and snarling, celebrating their attack on the village. His anger blazed hot at the sound, but he kept it controlled, channeling it into focus and preparation. Then he entered the cave, and battle was joined. Thor fought with all his skill and power, his hammer striking with the force of thunder, each blow ending one of the monsters. They were fierce and savage, but they were no match for God fighting to protect the innocent. The battle was brief, but intense, and when it was over, the monsters lay dead, and the cave was silent. Thor stood among the fallen creatures, breathing heavily, his anger slowly cooling. He felt no joy in the killing, no satisfaction in the violence. It had been necessary, a duty that had to be fulfilled, but it was not something to celebrate. He had ended a threat, prevented future attacks, but he took no pleasure in it. He left the cave and walked back through the mountains toward the ruined village. When he reached it, he spent time doing what he could to honor the dead and bless the place. He could not rebuild what had been destroyed or restore what had been lost, but he could ensure that the village was not forgotten, that the people who had lived there were remembered. Then, Thor continued his journey, leaving the valley behind. The encounter had reminded him that the world was not always gentle or kind, that there were real threats and real dangers that required strength to combat. His role as protector included both helping and fighting, both nurturing and defending. He had to be capable of both, had to be willing to do both, depending on what was needed. As autumn deepened, Thor found his steps turning north once more, back toward the mountains of Jotunheim. He had not visited the land of giants in some time, and he felt drawn to see how things were there, to check on the ancient fire and the people who depended on it. The journey north took him through lands growing colder as winter approached. Snow began to fall in the higher elevations, and the rivers started to freeze at their edges. Thor walked through these changing landscapes, watching summer fade and winter assert itself, the eternal dance of the seasons continuing as it always had. He crossed into Jotunheim and immediately felt the difference. The land was still cold, but it was a bearable cold, nothing like the deadly freeze that had threatened it in the past. The ancient fire was clearly still burning strong, providing warmth enough to sustain life even in this harsh realm. Thor made his way to the great hall where he had first met the old giant, all those years ago. The building still stood, as solid and imposing as ever, though there were signs of ongoing life and use. Smoke rose from chimneys, and lights glowed in windows, signs that the hall was still inhabited and active. He knocked on the great door as he had done before, and it opened to reveal a young giant, someone Thor had not met before. The young giant's eyes widened in recognition, for even the young giants knew Thor by sight. He welcomed Thor with respect and enthusiasm, inviting him inside and offering hospitality. Thor entered and found that while much had changed, much had also remained the same. The hall was still vast and impressive, still carved from living rock and decorated with ancient carving. But now it was warmer, more comfortable, with fires burning in multiple hearths and tapestries hanging on the walls. The young giant led Thor to a gathering hall where several other giants had assembled. They greeted him with warmth and gratitude, for they all knew the story of what he had done, how he had saved their homeland from eternal winter. They invited him to sit and eat with them, to share their fire and their company. Thor spent the evening with the giants, eating and talking, learning about their lives, and sharing news from the other realms. They told him about the changes in Jotunheim, how new areas were becoming habitable as the ancient fire's warmth spread, how their population was growing slowly but steadily, how they were rediscovering arts and skills that had been lost during the darkest times. He also learned that they had not forgotten his sacrifice, that the story of Thor and the ancient fire was taught to every young giant, passed down through the generations as a lesson about the importance of helping others and the possibility of friendship across old enmities. Thor listened to all this with quiet satisfaction. His choice all those years ago had indeed made a lasting difference, creating changes that rippled through time, affecting generation after generation. It reminded him again of the power of single actions, of how one choice could reshape an entire future. When the evening grew late, the giants showed Thor to a guest chamber where he could rest. The room was large even by giant standards, carved from solid rock but furnished with comfort. A fire burned in the hearth, and furs covered the bed, providing warmth against the cold that still permeated even this protected place. Thor lay down to sleep, his hammer beside him as always, and looked at the fire dancing in the hearth. He thought about all the fires he had seen, from the tiny candles in human homes to the great blazes in the halls of gods, from campfires under open skies to the eternal flames beneath mountains. Fire was life and warmth, light and transformation. It destroyed and it purified, it threatened and it protected. The ancient fire he had renewed was still burning somewhere deep beneath him, spreading warmth through the stone, making life possible in this frozen realm. His hammer had helped kindle that flame, had given it new strength to burn for ages more. And that flame, in turn, had transformed not just Jotunheim but also Thor himself, teaching him lessons that shaped who he had become. Sleep came gently, bringing dreams of fire and ice, of balance and harmony, of opposing forces working together to create something neither could create alone. Thor dreamed of the world in all its complexity, all its beauty and harshness, all its joy and sorrow, all its light and darkness. And in the dream he understood that all of it was necessary, all of it had value, all of it deserved protection and care. In the morning, Thor woke refreshed and ready to continue his journey. He breakfasted with the giants, thanked them for their hospitality, and prepared to leave. But before he departed, they asked if he would visit the place where the ancient fire burned, to see for himself how it fared. Thor agreed readily, curious to see the fire again after so many years. The giants provided him with a guide, a young giant who knew the deep ways beneath the mountains. Together, they descended into the earth, following passages that Thor half remembered from his first journey down into the darkness. The way was long but not difficult, for the passages had been improved over the years, made safer and easier to navigate. As they descended, Thor felt the air grow warmer, felt heat radiating from the stone around him. The ancient fire was still strong, still burning bright, just as he had hoped. Finally, they reached the chamber where the fire burned, and Thor stood once more at the edge of the pool of flame. It was magnificent, more beautiful and powerful than he remembered. The flames rose high, filling the chamber with heat and light, and Thor could see in them the same images and memories he had seen before. Visions of creation and transformation, of beginning and becoming. His hammer pulsed with warmth at his side, resonating with the fire, remembering its time within those flames. Thor reached out and placed his hand on the warm stone beside the pool, feeling the power flowing through it, feeling the connection between this ancient flame and all the life it supported above. He stood there for a long time, simply being present with the fire, honoring it, and the choice he had made to preserve it. Then he thanked the fire silently, thanked it for continuing to burn, for giving warmth and life to this harsh land, for teaching him lessons he had needed to learn. When he finally turned to leave, Thor felt complete, as if a circle had been closed. He had returned to the place where so much had changed, had seen the results of his choice, had confirmed that it had been the right thing to do. Now he could continue forward, carrying this knowledge with him, letting it inform his future choices and action. The journey back to the surface seemed shorter than the descent had been, as journeys often do when returning to familiar ground. Thor emerged into the daylight and breathed deeply of the cold air, feeling grateful for both the warmth below and the coolness above, for the balance between them that made life possible. He bid farewell to the giants and began his journey back toward the lands below, back toward the world of humans and the endless work of protection and service. As he walked, he thought about everything he had seen and learned, about how his long journey had come full circle, bringing him back to where it had begun, but as a changed being. Thor understood now that this was the nature of real journey. They took you away from where you started, changed you through experience and challenge, and then brought you back to familiar places where you could see with new eyes how much you had grown. The journey was not just about reaching destinations, but about the transformation that happened along the way. He walked through the winter landscape, through snow and ice, through forests bare of leaves and fields, silent under white blanket. The world was sleeping, resting, gathering strength for the spring that would eventually come. And Thor walked through this sleeping world, a guardian watching over the dreams of all who waited for warmth to return. His hammer hung at his side, warm despite the cold, glowing faintly with the power it had gained from the ancient fire. It was a reminder of where he had been and what he had done, a symbol of the choices that defined him. And as he walked, Thor felt at peace, knowing who he was and what he was meant to do, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of Thor and his journey to the land of giants would be told for ages to come. In the halls of gods and giants, in the villages of humans, wherever beings gathered to share tales of heroes and their deeds. But the greatest truth of the story was not in the grand adventure or the dramatic sacrifice, but in the quieter truth underneath it all. That truth was simple but profound. True strength lay not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to help. True heroism was found not in conquest but in service. And true wisdom came not from knowing all the answers, but from being willing to learn, to change, to grow. Thor had learned these lessons through his long journey, through his encounter with the old giant and the ancient fire, through countless smaller encounters and challenges that followed. And he would carry these lessons with him always, letting them guide his steps and shape his choices for all the days to come. The world needed protectors like Thor, beings of strength who used their power wisely and well, who fought when fighting was needed, but who also knew when to help, when to heal, when to step back and let others find their own way. The work was endless, the challenges were constant, but it was work worth doing, challenges worth facing. And so Thor continued his eternal journey, walking through the realms, helping where help was needed, protecting what needed protection, learning what could be learned. He was Thor, god of thunder, guardian of the 9 realms. And he would continue his work until the very end of all things, faithful to his purpose, true to his nature, always ready to act when action was needed. The mountains of Jotunheim faded into the distance behind him as Thor walked south, but they remained with him in memory and meaning. The ancient fire still burned beneath those mountains, and it would burn for ages more, providing warmth and life, a testament to the power of compassion and the importance of helping even those we might consider enemy. And in his hand, Thor carried his hammer, forever changed by its time, within the ancient flames, forever marked by the choice its bearer had made. The hammer was warm, always warm now, carrying within it a spark of that eternal fire, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple out through time and space, changing the world in ways beyond imagining. Thor walked on, through winter toward eventual spring, through cold toward warmth, through darkness toward light. His journey had no end, for the work of protection and service was never finished, but it had purpose and meaning, and that was enough. He was where he needed to be, doing what he needed to do, and in this, there was deep and lasting peace.